Hi, this is Seth Fleishman with World History by a Jew. Did you like the lecture? Well, guess what? I've got my own YouTube channel, World History by a Jew. You can either search it on YouTube, or if you just go to the address on the screen, that'll take you right to a bunch more of my videos. So if you enjoy what you're watching, you want to see more, you like what you're seeing, then please like the video on YouTube, subscribe to my channel. It's the only compensation I get. If you want to know even more about my projects, then get yourself added to the weekly email. Just send an email over to historybyjew@gmail.com and I'll be happy to add you to the list. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you at a future lecture. I'm back for a short. This is one of those lectures that's based on a question. I keep getting the same question over and over again about the Habiru, how they're connected to the Hebrew, if they're connected to the Hebrew people. So this is, most of the content is pulled from the King Tut miniseries, specifically the lecture that includes Akhenaten. But because this question keeps coming up, I've repackaged it a little bit and now spun this out to its own standalone lecture, so I hope you enjoy. Who were the Habiru people? They were a group of people that were identified in the Amarna tablets. So the Amarna tablets were these diplomatic documents, all written on cuneiform tablets, found in Amarna, or Akhenaten if you prefer, which was this was over about a 30-year period that covered the end of Amenhotep III's reign, all of Akhenaten's reign, and part of King Tut's reign. So it's like almost 400 tablets frozen in time, telling us about diplomacy at that point in Egyptian history. The Habiru people were repeatedly talked about in the Amarna tablets, and I've got a few samples here for you, which you can read through while I'm talking. But basically, these people were a group of people identified with this proper name. They operated basically in the land of Canaan and the surrounding area, but when you start looking at it, it ends up being Egypt, ends up being what's now Turkey, what's now Israel, what's now Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, and of course the center of it all is the land of Canaan. There are hundreds of references. Okay, so let's take like this one right here. This tablet 290, you see here on this map, you see 290, so you can see exactly what area it was referring to. All these little numbers here are different tablets that have been found that are identifiable what the geography is relative to the Habiru people. Now, so we have these hundreds of references, and they cover a 600-year span from about 1800 BCE to 1200 BCE. This is a very interesting period of time because this covers the time of Abraham through the time of Moses. So if you look at rabbinical dating, it's like the exact same 600-year period, which is quite interesting. Now, what can be a problem, we're going to get into this more, is that this was not an ethnic designation. Okay, this was a social class. And not only that, it was used with a negative connotation. So this was a lower class. These were slaves, maybe escaped slaves, maybe active slaves. They were servants, they were robbers, they were mercenaries. It wasn't a good thing when these kings were talking about the Habiru. There have been lists of names found. The majority of their names are Semitic names. In other words, that would tell you the majority of them were Semites, but not all of them. So you didn't have to be a Semite to be part of the Habiru. So the question is, does Habiru equal Hebrew? And we've got the etymology, which sounds, right, these two sound the same. We're about to spend a lot of time on this etymology. The chronology, I told you the 1800 to 1200 BCE. And then finally the proximity. All right, now, the proximity is this map right here. So all this sounds a lot like the ancient Hebrews is what I'm trying to say. To really delve into this, I thought we'd explore the etymology. So for those of you who like the etymology, this is going to be our most in-depth etymology discussion I've ever done with this group. All right. So first of all, before we talk about the etymology, I need to explain a little bit of the Hebrew for you. So for some of you, this Hebrew stuff is well known. For others, it's not. So I've broken down the rules of Hebrew into 3 key concepts you need to understand what's going on with this Habiru Hebrew thing. First of all, Hebrew is just a bunch of conjugated roots. So you've got these 3-letter roots. Over and over again, Hebrew uses 3-letter roots, and then you conjugate them for meaning. So you've got 3 letters here. So this is Mem, Lamek, and Chaf, and these 3 letters can have additional endings or vowels to mean different things. So here it's Melech, which is king. Here it's malachut, which is kingdom, and here it's malach, which is ruled, or malach, which is ruled. So this is my point in here, as you see, just by conjugating these three letters, you get three related meanings, all with the same root. Okay, that's part one. Part two, guttural letters. So the only guttural sound we really use in English is the H sound, the ha. Hebrew has more. Most people identify the chet sound, that cha. Every time, if you don't speak Hebrew and you hear Israelis, it just sounds like cha, 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 cha over and over again. But in biblical Hebrew, there actually were more of those. They've just kind of been lost over time. So the one we need to worry about tonight is ein. So ein, which is silent when you read Hebrew today, actually had a very soft guttural sound, a little bit like an H. Okay, so when you're writing the biblical Hebrew in today's English, you tend to see it with an H because this is the closest pronunciation, even though it's not exact. And then the last point I need to tell you before we move on is we have dual pronunciation of letters, which makes them interchangeable. So the main one we're worried about tonight here is bet. So bet, you see, if it's got the little dot, that's a b sound, and if doesn't have the dot, that's a v sound. So even though the letter is bet, the b and the v are interchangeable. And you can see I didn't even put them all, but there's other letters like this, like shin, can be shin or sin, or tav or sav, especially for the Yiddish speakers. So this right here is our three-letter root for Hebrew. So you have the ein with that soft H sound, you have the bet, which can have a B or a V sound, and then you have the resh, which is an R sound. That one's not so complicated. All right, now I think you're ready. I think we're going to compare the way the root word for Hebrew appears in the Torah. All right, so where did Hebrew come from? The word Hebrew, first of all, you got to step back. Let's talk about Semites. So Semites just come from Noah's son Shem. So any of the peoples that are descended, as the Bible tells us, from Noah's son Shem gets the name Semites. And already you see that interchangeability of the shin, right? It could be a sh sound or a s sound. So Semites for Shem. Now, he would have a great-grandson by the name of Eber or Ever, and it was through him we get the word Hebrew. So I've intentionally used just the English letters here to try to make it a little bit simple for those of you not familiar. So whether you say ever or ever, this B and B are interchangeable. Then you have Ivri, which is the Hebrew term for Hebrew. All right, now what does Ivri mean? It means crossed over, or more commonly, the other side of the river. And there's the word Hebrew, as much as it's so well known today, is only listed 30 or so times in the Torah. It's just not a common term for Jews, even though the language is now called Hebrew, even though the people are known as the Hebrew people. It's just not a common term because there's hundreds of instances of Israel. And of course, you know the term Israel as well, but Hebrew and Israel almost can seem to be equal. But if you count the instances in the Torah, there's a vast difference between them. So what I want to do is look at how Hebrew is used in the Torah, because this is going to be related to Habiru. First example, the use of the people Hebrew. So we have Abraham the Hebrew, and there I have it on both sides. You see the highlighted of the Hebrew and the in Hebrew, I should say, the Hebrew language, and then the English side. So here it is the Hebrew people, Abraham of the Hebrew people. Okay, next example, here's Ever or Eber. So here you see him being born, and you see on both sides, if you compare the Hebrew letters, you see they both have that three-letter root. And then our final use is we're going to jump to Joshua. Actually, we're going to leave the Torah and go into the prophets, because Joshua gives us a nice example here of the other side. So what's the other side? It's the other side of the river Euphrates. So it's saying that these people, your fathers, dwelt on the other side of the river Euphrates. So, and you see again, you have this three-letter root with Ever. And I'll just say one other thing in prophets about 1 Samuel. You can find King David. Before he was King David, he was referred to as like this paramilitary band, and he was like David and his bunch of Hebrews, which is going to be related to our next topic. So now what I've done is, if you look on the right-hand side, and don't worry, I'm not going to read all these to you, but if you look on the right-hand side, you've got all the uses of Hebrew in the Torah. Okay, now if you look on the left-hand side, you have a bunch of examples of the use of Israel. because I want to compare the two. So in this case, if you look at the top here under chapter 14, that you have a fugitive. He came to Abraham. So someone from outside came to Abraham, the Hebrew, and called him the Hebrew. So now let's go to the next one. This chapter 39 is when Joseph was in the Egyptian official's home, and his wife accused Joseph of trying to seduce her, and she used a derogatory term, calling him the Hebrew man, the Hebrew slave. Next, also about Joseph, when Pharaoh's court is talking about him, he's a Hebrew lad. Next, you have the midwives. When the Pharaoh is talking to the midwives, he's talking to the Hebrew midwives. All these cases, you're dealing with an outsider talking about Jews, okay? Bottom here is a little bit different. In this case, we're talking about slaves. So when the Torah is dealing with slaves amongst the Jewish people, it refers to them as Hebrew slaves. All right, now I want to skip over to Israel. All right, so when you look at Israel, when Jews are talking amongst themselves, so when we're talking about our family from Jacob and our descendants from Jacob, we're all part of Israel. When Jacob and his family left Israel, and as our forefathers told us, they were the children of Israel. And then the children of Israel increased, right? That's part of our story. And then look here towards the bottom, this line, this opening line, you can see, I guess I should have looked it up, but like over and over and over again in the Torah, whenever God is telling Moses to speak to the Jewish people, he's saying, speak to the children of Israel. So what I'm saying is there's a fundamental difference of how the term Hebrew is being used and Israel is being used. In other words, the point is, when you're dealing with the term Hebrew, we've got a foreign point of view, an outsider point of view, talking about Jews. And then also the case of slaves. When you're dealing with slaves, they're Hebrews. When you're talking internally, when we're talking about our forefathers, or when Moses is speaking to us, we're Israel. So it's the internal point of view, the term is Israel. So what am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say here is the Torah is telling us there used to be a difference in the term. There was a distinction between Hebrew and Israel, and that logic is still there. You could still find it. It hasn't disappeared. We've just kind of lost that concept. And going back to 1 Samuel, it was on the previous slide as well. I think this is probably your single best example in the Tanakh, because if you look at verse 21, the Hebrews who were with the Philistines were fighting the Israelites. And the Hebrews switched sides to be with the Israelites. The only way that's possible is if the two did not have to be the same. In such a case, Hebrew does not necessarily equal Israelite. And the evidence is right there for you. Okay, so now that you've understood the Hebrew terminology, let's switch back to the Egyptian terminology. So it seems so far, why would you think that Hebrew and Habiru are two different things? Okay, so modern scholarship is clearly against the two being the same term. And we're going to explore why that's the case. The Habiru are not a tribe. And I agree, the Habiru are not a tribe, for sure. It's a class, not a tribe. And if you think of Hebrews and Israel as being the same thing, then that math doesn't work. These were not good people, right? They weren't spoken highly of. There was a negative connotation about them, especially when you've got kings talking about them. They did not think too highly of them. Number 3 is an issue with the role of the shepherd. So we have all these jobs. I mentioned on one of the previous slides. They were mercenaries, they were robbers, they were slaves, they were laborers, all this. There's only one inscription I could find about indicating the Habiru have a connection to shepherds. There's one tablet of Akhenaten saying that he's settled some Habiru in pasture land. Other than that, it's just not there. So that is a problem if you're making a connection. Now, the biggest argument I normally see, and by the way, this is used over and over and over again, is actually the etymology of the word āpiru, which is why it was so important to me to explain the etymology to you beforehand. Okay, so first of all, it has been confusion in Egyptology for a long time between the B and the P. It doesn't seem that Egyptians clarified the two like we would think today. However, there was some Ugaritic tablets found, I think it was 1939 or so. and they, because of their interaction with the Egyptians, it's found that it was more of a P. So while you would have seen Habiru written 100 years ago, it kind of became āpiru after that. And that became a big problem. The other problem is the root words, because, and that's where I'm gonna get to this cognates. I wanna look at the different definitions of the various versions of Habiru. So if we look at Hebrew as Hebrew, as I said, that's really the root is the other side of the river. That's where it comes from. When you look at the Egyptians, the term āpiru really comes from dusty or dirty is the best guess. When you look at the Akkadian, which is a very important root for us, if you're a Semitic speaker, this Habutu means a migrant. And also you can find it written from the Hittites and the Ugarites as well. I just want you to see that you have these multiple pronunciations, but our three primary languages that we're concerned with here today all have a different definition. So then the question is this really just a false cognate? So what's a cognate? A cognate, if you look here on number 1, a good example is the word desk in English, because the word desk is linked to the root to the word Tisch in German. Took enough German to know that. And then where this Tisch is actually related to discus, and in Latin, from Latin, and in Latin it just means a flat surface. So it's very easy to see how this discus and the D and the T are pretty interchangeable in German and English. Like in other words, in English we have dollar, in German you have taler. Okay, so the D and the T are pretty interchangeable. So when you start looking at discus and Tisch and desk, okay, it makes sense. It's all this flat surface and that's where you come from. That's a cognate. They all have that same root. A false cognate is the second example. So the second example would be that you have the English to have and the German haben, which sounds like they're the same, and they are the same. But then when you add the third language, Latin, into it, it's just coincidental that Latin looks the same. They actually have different roots. So an archaeologist studying etymology would tell you there's no way that āpiru, Habiru, and Hebrew could be the same word because they have different definitions and they have a different root that brought them to where they are. Now I'm going to tell you why that's not true. The word Babylon kills that argument, because if you look at the word Babylon, if you look at the Akkadian, this is where the word Babylon comes from, right? The Akkadian people, they gave us Bob plus Eli. By the way, this L should be very familiar to those of you who know the Torah. So it's a Semitic language, similar words for many things. So Bob plus L, and the M, just like Hebrew, Elim is God's. So just Hebrew also has that M sound for a masculine plural. So Bob Elim is gate of the gods. All right, that's where Babylon comes from. So really the Greek version is just a corrupted version of the Babelim, became Babylon when it became Greek. And of course, English, we got our word Babylon from that. I want to look at the Old Persian. The Old Persian language would actually call Babylon as Babiru. All right, so it's close. They look like related words. Let's look at the Hebrew, and I didn't put the Hebrew characters because I didn't want to complicate it, but the Hebrew is Bavel, and we're told in the Torah the root of this actually comes from the word Balel, which means to confuse. So it's got a different cognate. It's got a different reason for having the word Babel, and that's because it's from the Tower of Babel, that God confused the languages after the Tower of Babel. So that's where, so we have this play on words with Balel. Now I want to go, so Aramaic, which is kind of partially like Akkadian and Hebrew, you have this Babel. Again, it sounds very familiar. Now look at, in English, we have Babylon, but in English, we think of Babylon and we start wondering, well, does that work with Babel? Because God babbled the languages, right? All the languages got blurred. And we start thinking, oh, well, it's all related. English is related to because of Babel is related to Babylon, and Hebrew is related to Babel because the word Balel means to confuse. And then finally, but the problem is that's not true. The English actually comes from the Greek barbaros, right? The barbaros was non-speaking Greek people. That's where we get the word barbarian, but it's also where we get the word Babel. So why am I going through all this with you? Because I'm trying to tell you the number one argument for why the āpiru is not the Hebrew is because the words have three different definitions in the languages, even though they sound very similar. Now I'm showing you Babylon. It has 3 different definitions in 3 different languages, even though they sound similar. There is not a scholar on the planet that would deny that Babel is Babylon, that isn't Babylon. Everyone agrees on that. But it just shows you when it becomes to something that can justify the Torah, it can't be. There's just no way it could be. And this is an extremely important point. So that's I'm kind of loading you up with the philosophy. I hope it's not too much for you. So why do I think the Habiru are the same thing as the Hebrew? First of all, the pharaohs repeatedly referred to them as an unstable element of society. And if you read the start of the Exodus, that's exactly what the pharaoh says, is you have these people growing and uncontrollable. They were most active in the same date range as the patriarchs. I've already talked about that enough. They were most active in ancient Palestine, the now modern Israel, along with the surrounding area. The names, even if they weren't always Semitic, they were mostly Semitic. They were a lower caste of people, and clearly the Jews were a lower caste of people when the Torah started. They were repeatedly engaged in tribal fighting, like Abraham's battles with his 300 soldiers to save Lot. The Habiru were repeatedly captured as slaves, and over again we have inscriptions of them as slaves. There's no question they were slaves. They were also known to labor in both construction and the field. So I'm harking back to my lecture 2. If you remember those tomb paintings that I showed you. So what I'm saying is, it's okay that it's a real cognate in some languages and it's a false cognate in others. And it's just wordplay like Babel and Balel. This isn't an issue because it's just like Babylon. Now, let me summarize because I gave you a bunch of information. So let's just break it all down to the 3 simple points. Number 1, the original meaning of Habiru was probably migrant. And notice in Akkadian, it does mean migrant. And most likely, the other definitions were corrupted from that. But because migrants, who are usually dirty and filthy, are now going into Egypt, the Egyptians hear this word for them, and it sounds like dirty and filthy, so the Egyptians start using the same word. And then you take the Hebrew, and these people were from the other side of the Euphrates, and when they start calling themselves Habiru, because they're migrants, well, that also works for being the other side of the Euphrates. So it's not bad that they have different meanings. So let's look at this. What does this really mean? It means a Hebrew is a descendant of Eber, the Ivri. So that means a Hebrew could really, in this definition, be an Israelite, an Ishmaelite, an Edomite, a Moabite, any of these biblical peoples that we're told in the Torah are descendants of Eber. But Israel, an Israelite is specifically defined as a descendant of Jacob, right? And Jacob is 7 generations back from Eber. So in short, Hebrew is a social class designation. I feel very confident about this. Being Israelite means you are of the Hebrew social class, right? If you're Israelite, you're part of this Hebrew social class. However, being Hebrew does not mean you have to be an Israelite. You could be an Ishmaelite, you could be an Edomite, you could be a Moabite. And I see that the Tanakh is laying this out for us. The Tanakh is showing there's a real separation between the 2 terms. We've just kind of lost it over time. And this is intimately connected with the Habiru concept. Okay, so that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, if you just want to help our little history project here, feel free to like the video or subscribe to my channel. And I look forward to catching you next time.